That's right.
Yeah, I've already signed one of them. There's another one.
And all I have to see. Anyone else want to serve? Excuse me, guys.
really appreciate everybody taking the time to come here today. I guess we'll survive if a few people come in late. Just so you know who I am, my name is John Lott. I've been an academic most of my life. I've had positions at Wharton Business School, University of Chicago, Yale, Stanford. I was chief economist at the U.S. Sentencing Commission in Washington. Most of you may know me from my book, More Guns, Less Crime, though I've written 7 other books. But right now, I've kind of gotten tired of the political correctness in academia, and it took a while for me to get tired of it, but eventually. I've started a center called the Crime Prevention Research Center. And some of the reasons why we've done this is, and I've gotten help from people like Brad Dorr and Ted Nugent, and we have about 20 academics around the country, kind of from my travels, people that I've gotten to know at the University of Chicago or Wharton or Harvard or other places like that, who kind of know where the data is on a lot of these issues and can go and get to it relatively quickly. You see lots of claims being made, whether it be by the president or whether it's by Bloomberg or Soros or others. And I just think it's useful to have some group of people who kind of know the data well and can try to quickly respond in a short period of time in kind of the news cycle where it's relevant. And also to hopefully do other research that makes them have to respond to us, but trying to accurately go out and figure out both the benefits as well as the costs of gun ownership. You know, it's amazing how much misinformation is being put out there right now. We just had a report that came out recently that was Fox covered about the FBI report on mass shootings. And if you looked at a report that came out right before the election last year, the FBI claimed that from 2000 to 2013, there was this huge explosion in mass public shootings. Surely something that got people's attention. It was a front page story in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, virtually all the newspapers around the country just a few weeks before the national election. And it helped to galvanize, at least to some extent, the gun control issue before the election. I've looked at FBI reports for 30 years, and I've never really seen something like this happen before, where there's always been kind of a Chinese wall between kind of political interests and what type of data or how the data is collected by the FBI. You may have places like, we have seats up front if people want to sit down. You know, you may expect the Bureau of Justice Statistics or the National Institute of Justice may use the data for political things, but you always like to believe that the data itself that the government puts together is actually correct. And there are a lot of big errors with this. I'll just go and talk about a couple things. One is they miss a number of mass shootings. The problem is that the ones that they miss are very heavily at the beginning of the period. So, you know, there are cases where 4 people have been killed at one time, or 2 people, or what have you, been killed. There's one case where 2 people were killed and 21 people wounded that they missed. The problem is by missing the cases in this earlier period, it makes it look like it used to be relatively safer than it was before. And so that helps make the line go up more. And secondly, what they included also in what they call active shooter cases. This is something that's a fairly new term from the Obama administration. It basically talks about somebody firing a gun in public and not necessarily involving anybody get killed or injured. Nobody even shot. And so here's the problem with it. It's not so much, I mean, it's not really as obvious why I just want to count and look at all times where somebody shoots a gun in public. But, because there are a lot of different reasons for it, presumably distinct from mass shootings. But the problem comes down to how they put the data together. And there's no data set for these so-called active shooters. You know, if you're talking about murder or rape or robbery, There's certain criteria, police departments collect that data, and then they go and turn that over to the FBI in the Uniform Crime Report numbers that they put out each year. The problem here is, since police haven't been collecting this stuff, the FBI went out and put its own data set together. And the problem comes in terms of how they did it. They basically did Google News searches. I don't know how many of you use Google News searches. I assume a fair number from time to time. Here's the problem with it, and that is, let's take a case where there really was a big mass shooting. Let's say 4 people were killed. If I were to do a Google News search the week after the attack, I may get 800 news stories on it. If I wait 5 years and do another news search on it 5 years later on that same attack, I may only find 500 news stories. If I do it 10 years afterwards, I may only find a couple hundred. What happens is that, news companies go out of business. They don't want to pay a lot of money to keep all their old stories online for you there, so they erase it so they can keep more recent things. Companies go out of business. Links get broken. And so over time, now, when you're talking about a case where there's 4 people killed, they got a lot of news attention, even 20 or 30 years later, you're still going to find news stories about that incident after it occurred. Because there's so many news stories that you can lose a lot, and you'll still have things there. But when you're talking about these active shooters where you have nobody shot when the gun's fired in public, you're lucky to get 1 news story on that to begin with. So you may be very likely to get that news story 1 or 2 or 3 years afterwards, but there's a good chance 5 years afterwards it's not going to be there. There's an extremely high probability that it's not going to be there 10 years after the event occurred, or 13 years later. So it's not, so basically what they have is that 80% of their, quote, active shooter cases are just in the last 4 years or so of their data. Now, does that mean that there are no active shooter cases where somebody fired a gun in public and nobody got shot in 2000 or 2001? No, it doesn't mean that. It just means that the way they collected the data, something that I'm sure anybody who works with this type of data knows and understands, they're just not picking it up. So that makes these later periods look relatively more dangerous than the earlier years simply because of the way they've measured it. So that makes it higher here, and we talked about why it's lower before. Plus, even after you include the cases in these earlier years, anybody who works with this data knows that 2000 and 2001 were relatively quiet years. 1999, you had Columbine, you had lots of other things that happened that year, was a fairly active year. Was very hot. And so, if you were to just look at cases where 2 or more people have been killed over the last 40 years, Bill Landis at the University of Chicago and I, when I was there, put together a data set going back to 1977. It's actually fairly flat. It's not really statistically significantly different in terms of the rate. If you actually were to look at 3 or more, or 4 or more, it's actually even flatter than that. One thing that's happened over the last year or so, Bloomberg has these reports that come out on school shootings. And, he's been saying since Newtown, there's been 100 school shootings that have occurred. It makes it sound to most people that there's somehow a new epidemic of these types of attacks occurring. I put out a piece at Fox News at the beginning of last year, first of all, going through the numbers and just talking about the types of cases he was including to get, at that time it was like 74. But he was doing things like there was a case in Florida where they had just changed their law the previous December where concealed carry permit holders were allowed to have their gun locked in their car when they were on university property. And in January last year, he was attacked, a young man at school there was attacked by 2 men, one of them carrying a pool cue. He was being beaten, was luckily close to his car, was able to get to his car, open the door, grab his gun, and wound one of the attackers. Well, Bloomberg people counted that as a school shooting. And, but you have other cases where you may have a gang shooting right off of school property. Another case where somebody was a couple blocks away and he was gambling with some others. You know, not school individuals, not people related to the school, attending the school, or anything else. At like 2 a.m. he's gambling and they got into a dispute about it. Look, gang fights are important, and we care about trying to reduce gang fights, and there's a whole discussion we can have about that. But it's different than these types of mass shootings that we talk about in terms of Newtown or other types of cases. And to go and lump in something that didn't even occur on school property, didn't occur during school hours, didn't involve students that were at the school, as trying to link it into Newtown type things is just not very useful for the discussion. And it gives people a real misimpression. So what we did at the Crime Prevention Research Center, we went through and just counted the number of deaths at K through 12 schools and universities. It's pretty much the same pattern for both if you break it down. But you can see over time how the number of deaths, you know, non-gang, non-suicide type deaths have declined over time, over about 20 years that we have data for that. You know, Bloomberg here's the thing. When Bloomberg puts out one of these reports, it's amazing how much news coverage they get. You know, when you want to do a Google News search or a Bing News search on this, you'll find within a week afterwards, they'll get like 3,000 news hits on it. And the thing that's most depressing is if you read through the stories, is they virtually never ask anybody critical of the report to comment on it. You know, I know if I put out a story, if I put out a report, it's kind of mandatory journalism to get somebody on the other side to talk about it. The funny thing when you're dealing with the Bloomberg people is I got a call from CNN saying, can you come on to talk about such and such an issue? I say, sure, I'm happy to do that. And then they'll call me back about an hour later, sometimes when I'm in the car to the studio, and they'll say, yeah, the Bloomberg people don't want to debate anybody. They just want to be on by themselves on the show. And they say, you know, we're really sorry, but, I mean, I can just imagine if I were to go to the CNN producer and say, nah, you know, I just want to be on by myself. I really don't want anybody else on. I'm sure I can just imagine what their response would be. Fortunately, so virtually always the invitation ends at that point. But my oldest son is a producer at Fox News, and last year they were putting together a show, and Bloomberg basically did the same thing. So they would be happy to come on as long as I wasn't on the show. But they were dealing with my son in this case. And he basically said, look, you know, we want to have a debate, we want to have an exchange of ideas. We'd love to have you on to go and provide your side of the story, but we're going to go ahead with the show in any case. And so they just didn't show up. So just myself and the host. It'd be nice. Unfortunately, I only have one son to do this. If I could go and get them kind of spread throughout CNN and other places, maybe we could put enough pressure on them to actually feel that they have to show up. Because if they got that response from other places, they may feel that they actually have to show up, because otherwise they can't get their side being represented there. But I don't know. I have other sons, but I have to convince them to go into that business. So, anyway, here's another one of these studies that they had come out last year, where they looked at mass shootings. And they were trying to claim that so-called assault weapons were much more lethal in terms of mass shooting attacks. And I'm sure in this audience, I don't really need to explain too much that this term assault weapon is kind of a made-up term. It's just a semi-automatic gun that looks like a military weapon as opposed to a hunting rifle, but it fires the same bullets with the same rapidity, doing the same damage. So this is their data. They say, look, they picked these years I can guess why they pick the years that they do. When I do a study, and this kind of got me into this to begin with, when I do a study, I usually try to use all the data that I can get a hold of, rather than just picking some arbitrary start date. Because people say, well, what about earlier years? Was it different or not? I can give you an example. Let's say I flipped a coin 20 times, got 10 heads and 10 tails. If I let you just go and arbitrarily pick some subsample of that, you could pick like 5 heads. Could you go out and then claim that the coin is unfair because you got 5 heads on it? My question would be, why did you only look at 5 coin tosses? And are those representative of all the other coin tosses that you had information on? Anyway, so let's just take their time period from January 2009 to July of last year. They were saying assault weapons resulted in average death in these mass shootings of 7.7. For other types of weapons, it was 4.7. One of the things you quickly learn when you go through Bloomberg reports is that these guys not only make up stuff, but they can't add. They can't do, division and little, I know, maybe they could get some help from somebody, I don't know. But anyway, if you actually look at their data, it's 7.3 and it's 4.9, so it's a little bit different. But then what happens if you just include all semi-automatic rifles in here? That lowers it to 6.4. But then, just this issue of the time period that they picked, how about if we just excluded just Newtown as an unusual case and just say all the other mass shootings that occurred over these 5 years or 5.5 years, how does it look? And what you find there is that there's essentially no difference. It's 5 using their measure of assault weapons. Actually, if you look at all semi-automatic rifles, it's 4.7, and for others, it's 4.9. So it's actually a little bit less there, but there's no real difference there between them. One of the other things they did, they have this report. In this report, their big claim was that mass shootings occur where guns are allowed. So they were claiming 86% of mass public shootings occurred where guns were allowed. Only 14% occurred in gun-free zones. If I look at that same period of time, I find pretty much even more than the opposite. Only 8% occurred where guns were allowed. The other 92% where guns weren't allowed. Here's the difference between us. One example, I'll just start with the Sikh temple one first. They relied on news reports for finding out whether a place is a gun-free zone. I have to tell you, one of the more frustrating things to me in dealing with the media over the years is I can't tell you how many news editors I've talked to, and I said, why don't you guys mention whether an attack's occurred in a gun-free zone? They mention the type of gun used, they tell us where the person got the gun. Often those things are completely wrong. They get those out within a couple hours of the attack. We find out a week later or whatever it was something quite different. The easiest fact for the news media to go and check is where it occurred. Even if they can't get near the place, they can get a pair of binoculars and just look to see whether it's posted in terms of signs that are there or not. Or they can go and look up the law there to see whether or not people are allowed to carry. They just look at the news reports. And the Sikh temple is one interesting example. It's one of the few cases where the media actually mentioned that no guns were allowed in the temple. But they seem to miss that one story in terms of including this as a place where guns were allowed. We see other cases. The Washington, D.C. Navy Yard in Fort Hood. I had a son who was actually stationed at Fort Hood when they had the attack last year, just literally about a block and a half away from the shooting. So it kind of makes all this research a little bit more personal. He's not going to go into the media. He's going to do something else. But anyway, I don't know if anybody's been on a military base. I assume the Bloomberg people have never been on a military base. But, Fort Hood is like a city. You have 50,000 people there. Sure, they have extra guards at the entrances there. But the rest of it is like the MPs go around and loot, cars. It's like a regular police force anyplace else. Do you expect walking around in Nashville that if somebody were to start doing a mass shooting on the street that there's going to be a police officer immediately nearby you? Probably not. The odds of that happening are pretty low. And the same thing is true with Fort Hood or with the Washington, D.C. Navy Yard. The killers in those cases depend upon the other soldiers there at the base obeying the rules and not being allowed to go and carry weapons. My son was in Afghanistan, served in Afghanistan. He just came back at the beginning of last year. And when he was in Afghanistan, he was required to keep his weapon with him at all times. He went to work out in the gym, he took the weapon with him. He went to go and eat, he had the weapon with him. He walked around the base, he had the weapon with him. The only place he wasn't allowed to take it in was when he was, had a physical exam or something in the doctor's office that was there. But they're even talking about changing that. But he wasn't allowed to go and carry it with him at Fort Hood. But, or they have this attack at the Tacoma coffee shop a few years ago. And they say, well, there are 5 police officers who were in, or 4 police officers who were in there at the time who were being shot. That's who the attacker went after. One thing I've tried to make clear with this gun-free zone argument since I brought it up in '98 was that we're not talking about places where police officers are banned from carrying guns. We're talking about cases where general civilians aren't allowed to go and carry guns for protection. When you're talking about these mass shootings, police have a particularly difficult job in dealing with this. They're in uniform. If an attacker is going to attack, they're the ones who stand out. They're the ones that are likely to go and attack first. You look at Israel, for example. They've had terrorist attacks since even before they became a country. And for decades after they became a country, their response was to put more military, more police on the streets in order to try to stop attacks. But they very quickly learned that terrorists have huge strategic advantages. They determine the time and the place for attacks to occur. And so they found that, let's say you had a couple terrorists on a bus, and you had, one terrorist on a bus and a couple of police. What can the terrorist do? He can either kill the police first and then start shooting others, or he can wait for the police to leave the bus and then do the attack, or he can go and attack someplace else. If the terrorist is simply willing to be patient long enough, there'll be some opening that occurs. But the thing that changed in '72 when Israel started letting its citizens go and carry concealed handguns is that that took away the strategic advantage that the terrorists had. Because even when the police left the bus then, the terrorist doesn't know whether somebody in front or somebody behind or somebody on the side might be carrying a concealed handgun. So they don't know who they're supposed to go and take out first. They may try to take out the wrong person first and find the person behind them is the one that they really should have been worried about there. So, here's another one, Carthage, North Carolina nursing home. You go through the news reports, none of the news reports mentioned it, so that whether they were a gun-free zone, so I guess they just assumed that it was. If you ever go to my old website, johnrlott.com, you would have found I had called them up, like within a few days after the attack there, just to find out what the rules were. And one thing I've done over time is that when these attacks occur, I'll often try to find people who live near a store or whatever to go and visit, to take pictures to see if they're posted or not, and I'll put those things on my website. Gradually, so I can't tell you how many people can testify to the fact that I bothered them over the years to try to find this out, this type of information out. But I can go through here, it's just amazing. And even this period of time, this 2009 through 2014, I think gives you a misimpression. This is kind of the date period that we're talking about, because I only know of 2 public mass shootings that have taken place where people are allowed to have guns in Tucson, Arizona, at the Gabby Giffords one, and in in Reno, Nevada at an IHOP, and both of those are in recent years. And so if you went back to 1950, which is as far back as we've gone on this, so it's at least since 1950, there's only been 2 exceptions where these attackers have occurred where guns are banned. And so, it's just this period of time. If they were to have gone back like we have, this percentage would be just a tiny fraction of 1%. You see, Obama makes claims all the time. Actually, I had talked to Glenn Kessler, and he got this out here. It's just an example of stuff we do. I just go through a couple of his quotes here. Obama just gave a talk a few weeks ago at a college in South Carolina, where he says, what we also have to recognize is that our homicide rates are much higher than other industrialized countries. I mean by like a mile. And most of that is readily available, is due to the ready availability of firearms, particularly handguns. Well, we got the Washington Post to give Obama 3 Pinocchios on all these things. So here we have, these are just too bizarre to even go through. But it's, in some neighborhoods it's easier to buy a firearm than it is to buy a book. And there are neighborhoods where it's easier to buy a handgun and, I assume you meant magazines, than it is for you to buy a fresh vegetable. Or people say, well, we should have machine guns in bars. That's been a big push of ours to have machine guns. You think I'm exaggerating? I mean, look at some of these laws that come up. So anyway, so we got Glenn Kessler to go through this. I basically sent him the data. And he noticed that there were other, not only aren't, the red line here is the U.S., not only aren't we a mile higher than some of these other countries, but there are other countries that are like a mile higher than ours. But, and I would just add as an aside, it's very misleading to go and talk about the United States as a whole when you're talking about homicides. I don't know if you've read More Guns, Less Crime or whatever, but basically what I point out there is that if you look across the United States, about 3% of the counties in the United States account for about 75% of the murders. And if you ever look inside that 3% of the counties, even in those counties, the murders aren't evenly spread out. They're usually very heavily concentrated in just 2 or 3 areas, even within those tiny set of counties that are there. And so, and of course, the urban areas tend to be where legal gun ownership is relatively low to begin with. Rural areas, it's the highest. But in any case, I don't put a lot of stock on cross-sectional stuff, but I'll just show you this. If you just look at developed countries and look across countries, and use this data from the small arms survey, which I'll talk about in a second, even here you find a negative relationship that exists between gun ownership. They measure it as firearms per 100 people and homicide rates. Anybody read the New York Times? All right. I almost feel I have to read it just so that I know what other people are saying on these issues. But if you read the New York Times over the last year or so, there's like at least 40 articles, I stopped counting at some point, where they refer to this small arms survey, which is a Soros-funded group that's based out of Geneva. And they claim that the United States gun ownership rate is about 88 per 100 people. Switzerland is 47 per 100 people. Israel is like 7 per 100 people. Anybody been to Israel? How many of you believe that the gun ownership rate or gun possession rate in Israel is like 8% of the gun possession rate in the United States? Anybody believe that? Who's been there? You have like 15% of the adult Jewish population is licensed to carry guns with them. In the United States, we're about 5% right now. And so, just having people being able to carry with them is much higher than 8 per 100 people. But what they've done here is, in Israel, most guns are not privately owned. most guns are technically owned by the government. Now, you apply for it and they give you a gun. You may have possession of that gun for 50 or 60 years, but it's still technically owned by the government during that period of time. Now, do we care if we want to look at this relationship, whether people technically own the gun or whether citizens are walking around carrying guns? I assume it's the latter that's there, right? And if we were to actually do it that way, Israel probably has a higher gun possession rate than we have here in the United States. In Switzerland, this survey is from 2007, and back at that time, able-bodied males between the ages of 18 and 42 were required to keep machine guns in their home. May also be required to keep some handguns. After age 42, you can apply and ask to keep it, and they would keep it there up until 65, where then you're given an option of purchasing the gun. Anyway, if you were to count those that, again, are in possession rather than technically owned by the government, Switzerland would also have a higher gun possession rate than what we have here in the United States. I'll just mention one, and if you fix just those two countries, that makes the line even more negative because these are low murder rate, low homicide rate countries. I'll just mention one thing to you because I've been talking about the impact that people like Bloomberg can have on the debate. I don't know if you know this, but Switzerland no longer has these militia having the guns in their home anymore. Basically, what happened was George Soros spent many tens of millions of dollars funding studies in Switzerland, this public health stuff that we'll be talking about more in a minute, claiming about the risks of having guns in the home. And they basically got an initiative through that changed the rules there. And so I'm, to some extent, worried that they could do the same thing here if they spend enough money on these types of things, which is one of the reasons why we've set up the Crime Prevention Research Center. But you can see here homicide rates across all countries, and I'll just mention some of the countries with what we think are by far the highest homicide rates don't even count the numbers. So you're missing some really high countries over here, like Zimbabwe and really nutsy countries that maybe God only knows how high their homicide rates are. But the United States homicide rate here is in red. The median value across all countries is in green. The average for just the countries that we can measure is in blue there. And if you look across all countries again, that they did the survey, and the survey, the small arms survey, ignores some countries, I think, on purpose. But even if we use the countries that they want to have, and don't worry about fixing it for the types of things I would say, you still find a negative relationship between homicides and gun ownership. It's not just putting out bogus studies and numbers that they do. In May, Bloomberg is working with the Columbia Journalism School, the Dart School there, to bring in journalists from around the country, I guess several hundred journalists that basically Bloomberg's paying for their plane fare, putting them up in a nice hotel for a couple of days in New York. And they're going to teach them how to go and report on the gun issue. And so there are 15 so-called experts that are there. 5 of them are academics who are clearly gun control experts, gun control advocates. Two of the 15 are conservatives. Neither one are kind of expert. One is S.E. Cupp. She's going to talk. She's a nice person, I'm sure, but she can't debate academics on this stuff. It's more for window dressing. All the police that they have there are gun control advocates. All the researchers there are gun control advocates. And, it's just their way of kind of, these guys are smart. They're really looking at things across the board. They're not only trying to produce the research, but then they're bringing in reporters to go and teach them how to, quote, properly report on that. Now, you would hope a journalism school their thing would be balance. You got to report both sides of the issue. You'd like to believe that they would teach their students and reporters that, but they're working with Bloomberg. If you went to the Columbia University website page, it's like it was written by Bloomberg. Some of the stuff that we've talked about in terms of school shootings, they just uncritically copy that in their discussion about what they're going to be teaching here. Just related to that, we just put out a survey of economists who have published in peer-reviewed economics journals who have done empirical research on guns and firearms. And Gary Mauser and Simon Fraser did this for us, and I'll show you some results from that. But what we found, this is just Washington Times from this past Thursday, economists who research guns and crime overwhelmingly believe that firearms are a force for protection more than a danger to owners and their surroundings, according to a new poll of academics. Now, I just want to go through a little discussion, then I'll bring this back. You know, there's room for optimism on this. If you look at polling over time in terms of people's views, whether they're for or against more gun control, the blue line shows opposition to gun control. The red line here shows support for more gun control. Generally, up until the late 1990s, 1999, 2000, support for gun control was increasing, or opposition to it was falling. Sometime around there, things started to change. It's not a perfectly straight up thing, but generally, the path is towards, since 2009, has been towards more opposition to gun control. And so why is that? Now, I wish I had survey data going back further. I'll just mention this. One of the big reasons, and this has increased over the last 4 decades, that people own guns is now for personal protection. You can see it's 60%, 36% for hunting, 13% for recreation. But that personal protection, I think, really drives a lot of people's views. So here's Gallup. Gallup has a survey on, do guns make homes safer? As I said, I wish they had this before 2000 because my presumption is these numbers were going in the opposite direction before that. But since 2000, if you look at the percentage of people who think having a gun in the home makes them safer, it was only 35% back then. Now it's 63%. In terms of people who think it's more dangerous, it used to be 51%, and now it's 30%. That's a dramatic change. And my guess is it's that change in beliefs, and we can talk about why, but it's that change in beliefs that explains the change in the overall support or opposition to more gun control. Now, Pew has a similar thing, only it's over a much shorter period of time, so it's not particularly useful. But they say, do guns protect people from crime or put them at risk? And you can just see since 2012, it's gone from 48 to 57% of people think guns protect people from becoming victims. And this includes not just guns in the home, but concealed carry. On the other side has been this public health push. And this has been where Bloomberg and Soros and President Obama and others have been putting a lot of their money into public health. And there's just huge problems with this public health research, though. One is they don't understand this issue of causality. Let me just give you a fast example here. Probably one of the more famous claims in the gun control debate has been that having a gun in the home is more likely to result in the death of you or a loved one than it is to go and result in the death of a criminal. What they did on this would be what they did on this was to kind of tell me my time. I'm sure people can attest here. I tend to talk, but and I want to give you guys some time for questions. But I have so much I want to tell you on this. But it's so let me just give you a quick example. What they would do is they would look at a city over the course of the year, find people who died from firearms, and then ask the relatives of the deceased whether the person owned a gun. And then they would go and take a control group of people who were the same age, sex, and race who lived within a mile of the deceased and ask them whether they owned a gun. And then they run a regression on whether you died, on whether you owned a gun. They just assumed that if you owned a gun and you died from a gunshot, or somebody related to you died from a gunshot, that it was that gun that was used in the attack. When people have gone back, they found that 86% of those deaths were actually due to a weapon that was being brought in from the outside. But let me just give you an idea of the theoretical problem. There's other data problems I can talk about there too. Let's say I were to use that method to go and study how good hospital care works. This is public health guys, something that you think they would think about. Let's say I looked at people who died in the city over the course of the last year, asked their relatives whether the person had been to the hospital. And then I go and find people who are the same age, sex, and race who live with a mild deceased, who hadn't died, and ask them whether they've been to the hospital. Now, if I run a regression on whether you died, on whether you've been to the hospital, what do you think you'd find? Probably people who went to the hospital are more likely to die. Now, should we go and lobby to ban hospitals tomorrow? I hope not, because there's probably something different. There's something different about somebody who felt they needed to go to the hospital, probably they were sick, versus somebody who didn't feel the need to go to the hospital. So it's not like, were sick people who felt they needed to go to the hospital more likely to die than people who were healthy and didn't feel the need to go to the hospital? I'm sure that's earth-shattering. But I hope we wouldn't go and use that to go and lobby against hospitals, all right? And so, as an economist, what I would do is I'd try to find two people who are equally sick, and then try to find things that might cause one person to go to the hospital or another not. So, is the cost of going to hospitals increasing? Or did they shut down a hospital in the area? So somebody who would have gone to the hospital now doesn't go to the hospital. That's the way an economist would approach it. That's not the way the public health people do. They do it the way I just was telling you. And I just give you an example. Here they have a study that just came out, got a lot of attention this last week from Harvard, where they did this survey of guns and anger, where they basically asked people, they say, have you lost your temper over the last 10 years? And gotten into a yelling match or physical fight with somebody. And then they also asked in the survey whether they own guns. And they say, look at this. People who own 11 plus guns are actually more likely, they were like 9% likely to say that they had lost their temper over the last year versus people who said they had no guns. Now, I'll just mention as an aside, these other ones, overall, there's no statistically significant difference between people who own guns and don't. I'll just mention as an aside, I've gotten to believe that these polls that ask people whether they own guns are pretty useless because I think a lot of people, even when they own guns, don't tell pollsters. I'll just give you one simple example. When people are asked whether they own a gun in the home, married men are twice as likely to say a gun is owned in the home as married women are. Could be they're not talking to each other. It could be the guy has guns and he hasn't told his wife about it. Maybe they should ask how many years they've been married or something at the same time. But it could also be that the women are somewhat less comfortable going and saying that they own a gun in the home than the men are. You never see anybody talk about that when they're talking about these surveys. I wanted to go and ask these guys, okay, so people with one gun are like half as likely to get angry. I think we ought to pass a law mandating that all these people ought to have one gun. So, obviously, again, we have this issue of causation that's there. But, and there's a gap in logic. Just because somebody gets into physical fights, even in the worst case there, that's not the same thing as saying that somebody uses their gun improperly, right? So, if it were me, I'd look at things like concealed carry permit holders. And what you find, and anybody who's read my stuff knows that they're incredibly law-abiding. Concealed carry permit holders are very law-abiding even compared to police officers. With this study, they take this one step further and say, because of this, we need to go and keep guns away from people who have misdemeanors, all misdemeanors. And I'm not really sure. Okay, so they showed somebody got angry. They're not even showing that they used a gun to do anything. And they're not even showing that there's a relationship between misdemeanors and whether people got angry or not. But it's just their way of going and trying to expand the number of people who aren't going to be able to own guns. you know, we have this tidal wave. I'm going to make this short now. You know, we hear Bloomberg putting in $50 million a year. That's just part of it. Bloomberg's putting in hundreds of millions of dollars more. There's 23 large foundations Obama got who were working with the healthcare issue that are now putting their money into gun control efforts. You have Soros. You have, I just mentioned earlier, the FBI report that Obama put out. And I just show you a graph here. You may remember, just to give you some background on why we put this together at the Crime Prevention Research Center. If you heard these claims that the 1969 budget restrictions on the Centers for Disease Control funding has stopped firearms research. How many people have heard that? Anyway, it's been all over. You do a Google News search, trust me, you'll come up with like 5,000 news stories on it. And but that came from a Bloomberg report. And it was so received wisdom, nobody even questions it in the media. And the thing is, what Bloomberg did was, while everybody talks about the number of studies falling, that's not the way they measured it. They measured it as firearms studies as a percentage of all medical journal research. How about if you just look, and I'll explain why that's wrong in a second, but how about if you just looked at the number of publications in medical journals on firearms? So this is when the CDC restrictions went into effect, this dotted line. Doesn't look like much of a decline to me. You know, it goes up and down a little bit, much higher at the end here. And here you have restrictions on the National Institute of Health. You know, only about 3% of firearms research in medical journals was being funded by the government. A lot of it is funded by people like Bloomberg, particularly now, or the Joyce Foundation or other types of private foundations here. But it didn't go down. Here's the thing. There's been a big increase in firearms studies in medical journals. It's just that other research in medical journals increased dramatically faster. So do we care about the share of journal articles, or do we care about the number that's there? And but see, this big increase that we're having, this is going to explode. We're already seeing this, saw this in 2014. I don't have the numbers in here yet. In 2015, it looks like it's going to be a banner year. But next year, we're just going to have a huge number of these stories that are going to be coming out. And it's being timed for the presidential election that's there. So they, you know, when I showed you that Gallup poll and why people's views on gun control's changed, they've seen the same thing. And so they've decided they're going to put out a lot more studies, and they're going to go and help teach journalists how to properly cover this stuff in order to do this. And so, you know, somehow we have to be out there and explain to people the problems on this, and hopefully put out some studies of our own that make them have to respond to us, rather than them just having the initiative on these things all the time. Well, I know you guys must have questions of your own. There are other things here I could talk about, but I'm happy to go and take some questions that people might have. Yes?
John, can you go into the details behind the 40% background or show myth?
Right. Well, President Obama has made this claim many times that 40% of, before I forget about it, there should be a couple lists passed around here for people if they want to be on our email list. I don't know. You pass these around. And if you want to get the type of information that we're going to be putting out over the next year or so, please sign up. I know some have signed up already. Okay, so here's the deal. Obama says that 40% of guns sold haven't gone through background checks. He uses an old survey from 91 through 94. Most of the people that were surveyed there, of the 251 giant survey, bought their guns prior to the Brady Act going into effect, so we didn't have the national background checks. And that survey claimed that it was 36% of guns transferred. So Obama rounds it up to 40%, changes it from transferred to sold. Now there's a big difference between transferred and sold, because most of that 36% were within family gifts and within family inheritances. So you get rid of those, and you're basically down to like 12%. But even that's misleading, Because I'm sure a lot of you must know that prior to the Clinton administration getting involved, there were a lot of FFLs out there. You know, you had these so-called kitchen table FFLs. I've gone back and interviewed a lot of them. The thing is, these people would be selling their guns in, you know, kitchen tables. And I've interviewed them, and they said they never told people whether they were FFLs or not. You know, they just say you have to sign this form. People would go and sign the form. But there's a good reason to believe, after talking to these guys, that a lot of the guns that they sold, people would never even know that they were FFLs. And so the question is, even that 12%, you know, most of it could be FFLs that were there. And you wouldn't even know, because you're just asking people, did they think they were buying a gun from an FFL or not? And there's other information that indicates people think that's only FFLs at stores that they went to. So we don't know the number, but my guess is if you believe that earlier survey at all, we were probably talking about something that's in the low single digits. But here's the big problem. And that is, the president often makes this other statement. He'll say 2 million prohibited people have been prevented from buying guns because of background checks. That's just completely false. What the correct terminology should be is that there have been 2 million initial denials. There's a huge difference between prohibited people, prevented, and initial denials. I'll give you a simple example. I'm sure you all remember the late Senator Ted Kennedy from Massachusetts. There were 5 times when he tried to fly on a plane where he was denied because he was on the no-fly list. They had somebody who had a similar name to Senator Kennedy that put him on the list there. Now, do we count those 5 times as 5 times we stopped a terrorist from flying? I assume not. Even if you don't like Senator Kennedy or didn't like him, it would be a bridge too far to go and call him a terrorist. But that's what Obama's doing with all these initial denials. Just as there was an initial denial for Kennedy getting on the plane, there was initial denials for people going and buying guns. And the thing is, virtually all these initial denials are false positives. And there's a safety issue here. And the safety issue is that while for most people, these initial denials may be an inconvenience, you know, being stopped from buying a gun for months. You know, it's not like you're Senator Kennedy where he can call up the Department of Homeland Security and say, you know, you guys blew it, get me on the plane. And, you know, within like minutes it'll be fixed. You guys have to hire a lawyer or whatever, go through the process. A lot of people, they say, well, only 50% of those are appealed. Who wants to go and spend money on a lawyer to go through the process? Not everybody's willing to spend what could be thousands of dollars to go through the process of doing that. And so, it goes beyond that. One of the big battles that's going to be coming up, and has already started, has been these expanded background checks, which I assume is part of the motivation for bringing up the 40% claim. And here's the problem. Not only is the current background check system a mess, all right, but it's costly to make people go through this. So like in Washington State, where they just, Bloomberg and others just got this initiative 594 on the ballot. And pass, right, yeah, right, and pass. You know, just as a side, you know, they're saying 90% people support, it's like 59% there, and they outspent.
A 30% voter turnout, and they spent over $10 million, and the pro side spent like less than $1 million.
Yeah, it was about 33-1 in terms of spending on the initiative. And so anyway, here's the deal. Even the proponents there were saying they would add $60 to $65 on the cost of acquiring a gun. Now, my research tells me that it's basically poor people who live in high-crime urban areas, particularly minorities, who benefit the most from owning a gun. It's the people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime who benefit the most from having the option to protect themselves. Police are extremely important. I can show you surveys, lots of surveys of police. They're on our website at crimeresearch.org. But the police themselves know that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crimes occur. And that's the reason why police are actually, I believe, the strongest supporters of private gun ownership in the country. And so anyway, you know, you go and put a $60, $65 tax on the people being able to go and get guns, that's going to stop some people from getting guns. In Washington, D.C., since they only have one FFL, it adds like $225 under the cost of being able to go and get a gun. That can make a real difference between whether or not a poor black who lives in D.C. is going to be able to afford a gun protection. In New York State, it's like $80 that's added on to the price of a gun. And so, you know, so that's the bottom line to me. One is the current background check system is a complete mess. Again, you go to our website and I go through the numbers so you can see how bad it is. And two, that rather than trying to fix the current system, they're expanding it, and they're going to be disarming the very people that they claim that they care the most about. So I hope I answered your question. Yes, sir?
I have a question about the first graph you had showing the skewed statistics about crime, like we said.
Well, as the mass shootings.
Yeah, I'm a little confused on how you said it was skewed. You showed it going, you know, going
Well, it's
way
very
up.
simple, okay? And that is, what they do is, they're missing cases that should be at the beginning, which makes it look lower. And then they're adding in cases that they only are finding because of the way they're looking for things at the end, which makes it look relatively higher at the end. If you make it lower at the beginning and higher at the end, what does that do to the line? It makes it steeper, right?
When you say they're missing the cases, are they just not reporting them, or?
They just don't have them in their data set. I know because I go through and I collect these cases. As soon as I start seeing the list of cases, I say, they're missing cases. They're missing cases where 4 people were killed. They're missing other public shooting cases. And then my next question is, well, is it over the whole period? No, they're just missing them at the beginning mainly.
So it skews it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Why do you think, despite the bias in the media and the surveys, that trends like the Pew study and the Gallup studies are trending in a positive direction for gun? What do you think is working counterbalancing?
I think there are two things that are occurring, and I have no idea how much each matters. I think at least since about 2005, Fox News, 2005, end of 2005, 2006, and much more now, Fox News is reporting defensive gun use stories. I think that matters. You know, I wrote a book, The Bias Against Guns, which basically tried to explain why people had the views that they had about guns. And I had data up through 2001 there. And at that time, you looked at ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC. There were a total of 0 defensive gun use stories during 2001. Fox had 1 defensive gun use story that was reported like once. And, but Fox, there's been effort. I've talked to editors and stuff. It took a little while to get them to change, but so like if I get it, you send me a defensive gun use story, I send it to one of the editors. You know, and some of those things get put up there. And, you know, it's important to get these things soon, you know, kind of like within a day or so. You know, a week later, it's not as newsworthy. So I think that's one thing. And the second thing is that the academic debate is entirely changed. You know, prior to 97, 98, you know, basically everything in academia was that guns were bad. Now, after that, you look at the work on concealed carry laws, and it's basically a debate between those who say guns make us safer and those who say it has no effect. So it's completely flipped there, and I think that's had some impact. You know, the fact that you have researchers out there who make claims, you know, I can make a claim, others can make a claim and say, I'll just give you a simple example. One effective thing that I say is that if you look at every place in the world that's banned guns, there's not been one single time where murder rates have fallen. Not one. You'd think out of randomness, you'd find one place that's banned guns and murder rates have gone down. I mean, I keep on bringing that up. I mean, I was stunned when I found it, because I gradually looked across countries. And it's like, these guys, they just are stunned into silence when you're debating them, because they have nothing to say on this type of thing. I mean, you at least think they could point to one country. I say, tell me one country where it went down. And so, I mean, I just think getting those types of facts out there, having it so that now we have, you know, my study came out in '97, but since then, you know, now we have several dozen peer-reviewed academic studies by economists and criminologists, by lots of different people now, that go and show that on net, for the vast majority of them, showing that concealed carry reduces violent crime. I think those, I don't know which is more important. The Fox thing started a little bit later, but I'm sure it has a big impact.
I think also my own theory is the internet, that's up where it was 15, 20 years ago, you had much more concentrated. The internet allows you to do your own research.
Right, the internet was pretty much around in 2000. I mean, I know we may forget, but but it's been around for a while. But it's, look, you know, there have been some sites, Keep and Bear Arms for a while used to do a pretty good job of keeping the records, but they kind of don't do it as frequently as they used to do it. You know, you still have the Armed Citizen column from the NRA, but there are a lot of other things. I mean, you know, the thing is, the Armed Citizen column is generally read by NRA members, which is great. Okay, but
doesn't get
you
out
got,
to the
if you're going
general
to
public.
change this, if you're going to change the poll numbers that are there, you got to get people in the middle of the debate. Here's one thing I was told a long time ago when I